Hello and welcome to the World Socialist Web Site's webinar, Organizing Resistance to Internet Censorship. I'm WSWS reporter Andre Damon, and I will be your host for today's event. I'm joined by Chris Hedges and David North, our guests today. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, the host of RT's On Contact, and a contributor to Truthdig. Chris has worked for nearly 2 decades as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times and other major outlets. He's the author of numerous books, including Empire Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumphs of Spectacle, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, The Death of the Liberal Class, and The Wages of Rebellion. Also participating is David North, who has played a leading role in the international socialist movement for 45 years. He is the chairperson of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist Web Site. His published works include A Quarter Century of War, the U.S. Drive for Global Hegemony, and the Russian Revolution in the Unfinished 20th Century. Today's event is sponsored by the World Socialist Web Site, which has been in publication for 20 years and is celebrating its anniversary this year. I would like to begin by inviting all of our participants to share this event as widely as possible with your friends, colleagues, and co-workers on social media. I would also like to invite all of our participants to comment and ask questions on the discussion page at endcensorship.org and on the Facebook page. Before we begin, we have received a number of messages of support for this event, and I would like to begin by reading one from journalist and WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. The future of humanity is the struggle between humans that control machines and machines that control humans, between the democratization of communication and the usurpation of communication by artificial intelligence. While the internet has brought about a revolution in people's ability to educate themselves and others, the resulting democratic phenomenon has shaken existing establishments to their core. Google, Facebook, and their Chinese equivalents, who are socially, logistically, and financially integrated with existing elites, have moved to reestablish discourse control. This is not simply a corrective action. Undetectable mass social influence, powered by artificial intelligence, is an existential threat to humanity. While still in its infancy, the trends are clear and of a geometric nature. The phenomena differs in traditional attempts to shape cultural and political phenomenon by operating at scale, speed, and increasingly at subtlety that eclipses human capacities. I commend the World Socialist Web Site for drawing attention to this phenomenon. I would also like to read a statement of support by Australian journalist and documentary filmmaker John PILGER, who writes, "As a journalist and filmmaker who has long navigated the mainstream, I offer my support to this important discussion between Chris Hedges and David North. Something has changed. Although the media was always a loose extension of capital power, it is now almost fully integrated. Dissent, once tolerated in the mainstream, has regressed to a metaphoric underground as liberal capitalism moves forward towards a form of corporate dictatorship. This is a historic shift, with journalists policing the perimeters of the new order. Witness the anti-Russia hysteria and the Me Too witch hunts, especially in liberal newspapers such as The Guardian and The New York Times. With independent journalists ejected from the mainstream, the World Wide Web remains the vital source of serious discourse and evidence-based analysis, true journalism. Sites such as wikileaks.org, WSWS.org, consortiumnews.com, globalresearch.ca, Democracy Now!, and counterpunch.org are increasingly targeted as offensive by Google and other giants, and the filtering and limiting of Google searches of these sites is rank censorship. These are not marginal sources, but crucial for people trying to make sense of a world in which science and technology have advanced remarkably, while mainstream democratic politics have regressed to the extremism of class warfare and incessant warmongering. The perverse contrivance of fake news is part of this, as is Russiagate. The broadcaster RT, which often does the job of Western liberal media has abandoned, would have been destroyed had it not been backed by a powerful government. The same might be said of Julian Assange, had he not demonstrated extraordinary resilience and courage and won the backing of a small, brave government. The matter is urgent. Voices must be raised. I urge my colleagues to break their silence. Now, I'd like to thank Julian Assange and John Pilger for those powerful statements. And I'd like to begin by going over some of the themes that they raised. Now, over the course of the past 6 months, David, the World Socialist Web Site has written extensively on Google's censorship of left-wing, anti-war, and progressive websites. Now, how did you come to the conclusion that this was taking place?
Well, as you said, we've been publishing the World Socialist Web Site since February 14th, 1998. And we carefully track our readership, and over the years we have seen a substantial growth. Of course, that growth tends to vary over periods of time, periods of greater political involvement, see a growth, but the general trend has been upward. Particularly in 2015, 2016, and into 2017, we saw a very rapid growth in the readership of the website, trending in the area of 60 to 70 to 80,000 individual hosts a day. In late April, or I'd say early May, we began to note a decline in daily readership. Initially, we thought this may be simply a seasonal trend, maybe a certain falling off after the first wave of anti-Trump demonstrations, but it persisted into June and at an exponential rate. And we recognized that this was something which was not normal. We also began to examine, to see whether we were uniquely affected, the statistics of sites which are often compared to ours. Truthdig, Counterpunch, other sites, Consortia News, Global Research. And we also saw that they were also being substantially hit. At about the same time, we became aware that Google had introduced a new algorithm, which it claimed was going to improve, reader experience. But it was very clear that this algorithm was being employed to undermine access to the World Socialist Web Site. I think you might have begun to show the scale of that. You have a graph, I think, which shows this, the rapidity with which this developed after April. In fact, the new algorithm introduced by Google, and Ben Gomez is their chief officer in charge of this. He issued a statement on the 25th of April, and right after that, this precipitous plunge begins. What we were able to determine, and we did this in consultation with other experts in search optimization, that what was being done was that the search terms, which most commonly would bring readers to the World Socialist Web Site, were being targeted, inoculated, so to speak.
I think we have some of them up.
Right. So of the 150 most popular search terms, which would bring readers to the World Socialist Web Site in April, by August, they would bring 145 of them would not bring any readers to the World Socialist Web Site. And you have some of the words there: socialism, Russian Revolution, class conflict. In other words, it isn't as they claim they were trying to protect people against clickbait and things like that. What's so specifically important about this is that in a period of growing political radicalization among young people, among workers, they start to look for oppositional information. They become interested in socialism, revolution, terms like equality. Those terms, which previously would bring thousands of readers to the World Socialist Web Site, now are bringing no readers to the World Socialist Web Site. In other words, they were setting up a quarantine between those who may be interested in our site and the WSWS. From being a bridge, Google was becoming a barrier, a guard, preventing access to our site. And initially, when we raised this, there were questions about whether or not the algorithm was, it was a pure coincidence. It was not politically directed. No one can seriously make this claim any longer. This is an absolutely concerted, conscious effort at the suppression of the World Socialist Web Site and other websites which present oppositional positions, which present a critical evaluation of the policies of the American government. And that is why the organization of the struggle against this has become so critical.
And we of course see on the screen now some of the fall in the search traffic to the World Socialist website.
Right,
Google.
I'll make one additional point. In April, about 45% of our readers were coming to the World Socialist website via searches. Google was a substantial section of those search enablers. Earlier this week, I checked again, less than 15% of our readers are coming through Google searches. Now, we have been able to grow since August our direct readers. About 50% of our readers come directly to the World Socialist website. But the decline in readers coming from searches continues to escalate. And the last time I looked at figures from Truthdig, you're facing the same situation.
Yeah, it's a whole series of left-wing, anti-war, and progressive websites, right?
It's part of a process that's been going on now for several years. Corporate capitalism, globalization, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, is in crisis. And it's in crisis in two ways. First of all, it has lost, the ideology itself has lost credibility. It no longer holds any currency across the political spectrum. It's been exposed as a lie. All of the promises of this ideology, which were utopian to begin with, the idea that it would create a global middle class and spread democracy. Thomas Friedman was one of the popularizers of this utopian vision. If we get out of the way and let the market rule. The devastation, the destruction, not only internally within the United States, but globally, has created rapacious oligarchic elites around the world, in countries like India or here, and essentially rendered huge sections of the population redundant or superfluous, surplus labor, Marx called it. That has forced these corporate oligarchic elites to use more and more draconian forms of control. We see it in the United States with essentially marginal communities becoming mini police states, the rise of mass incarceration, the use of felony convictions to turn especially poor black and brown people into a criminal caste. And the second crisis is that the ruling elites are frightened because they watched the political charade that they had set up in both the Republican and Democratic Party, where the leadership, whether it was the Bush dynasty or the Clinton dynasty or Barack Obama, have all been servants of the corporate state. John Ralston Stahl talks about the corporate coup d'etat, and this is correct in slow motion, but it's over. And so critics of capitalism, critics of imperialism, critics of the structure, such as myself, have been pushed to the margins, out of mainstream publications like the New York Times, where I worked for 15 years. And now what we're seeing, in essence, is that they no longer have a counter argument to make that anybody is buying. And so these marginalized critics, the World Socialist Web Site, will print critiques of capitalism, lift up the abuse of the working class, as will a handful. We're not talking about very many sites. Counterpunch is very good, Alternate. They are being targeted because the ruling elites now find these critics to be dangerous and potent. And so it's the intersectionality between these large Silicon Valley entities like Google and Facebook, and of course they're wedded to the national security state. Bezos has a $650 million contract with the CIA, for instance, and they are working hand in glove. And this is, of course, the danger of revoking net neutrality. This is part of this process to essentially erase these critics from the internet. And I would urge people to look at a very fine essay by Alexander Berkman. I think it's called The Idea is the Thing, but he talks about what happens when a ruling ideology, like let's say the divine right of kings under the monarchy, no longer has any kind of currency. And he said, this is what Gramsci talks about, Antonio Gramsci, when he talks about the interregnum. The period in time when the ruling ideology no longer has any currency, and yet there is this kind of amorphous period where people have yet to articulate an alternative vision. And that's where we are. And Berkman likens it to boiling water in a kettle, that you don't see the ferment at first. Everything appears to be quiet. Everything appears to essentially buttress the status quo. But underneath, some very dangerous to the ruling elites undercurrents are happening. And then when it explodes, he said it's like the steam and the whistle coming out of the kettle. And that's the moment we're in. And the elites know it. And so they are carrying out a preemptive attack against those of us who are enemies of the corporate state and corporate capitalism.
Well, I'd like to, just on we've obviously transitioned to the broader context of censorship. I'd like to direct a question to David. At the beginning of the year, the World Socialist Web Site posted a perspective in which it made a prognostication that this year would see a substantial intensification of the class struggle. And at the same time, as we've written, already with the new year, there's been a very sweeping attack on internet freedom just over the course of the past 2 weeks. Could you speak a bit about this relationship?
Well, I think Chris has raised what are very critical issues. He's spoken of Gramsci. I think we should go right back to what Marx said. I mean, we're going to be marking this year in May the 200th anniversary of the birth of Marx. Last year we were commemorating the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution, two events of immense contemporary significance. I mean, after all, if one wants to understand the world we live in, for all the changes in capitalism over the course of 150 years, the basic laws uncovered by Marx remained valid. You can't talk about, or you can't understand the world we live in without understanding the concept of value, the concept of profit, the declining rate of profit.
The concept of labor, which
surplus,
modern economists have erased.
Right. Well, that's right. In the end, in the final analysis, all value, the value is derived from the exploitation of the labor of workers. And far from the working class disappearing, another favorite mantra of the liberal and petty bourgeois academics, we actually are living in a world in which the very process of globalization has vastly increased the size and scale of the international working class.
Let's call them the working poor.
Well, yes, there are.
I mean, that's what the working class has been reduced to.
Well, there's a very important distinction in Marx, and the great achievement of Marx was to see, and of Engels, was to see the working class not only as an exploited class, but a revolutionary class. And it's a revolutionary class because, in the final analysis, it operates and is, of all the productive forces, the most important. And when we return to these very early writings of Marx, which were in fact a period where he was developing the critique of utopian socialism and petty bourgeois conceptions of improving society, he sought to establish a scientific analysis. And he not only elaborated the materialist conception of history, but he said that the operation of the class struggle leads to the socialist revolution, the assumption of power by the working class, or it created the objective conditions for that to take place. And when Chris correctly says, why are they frightened? The ruling class has a very, very fine instinct. I often feel that one of the problems on the left is an excess of pessimism and not grasping for all the difficulties and all the problems, and no one who seeks to fight the capitalist system is unaware of the enormous problems and dangers involved. But the ruling class tends to be very aware of these dangers, and correctly you say this is a preemptive strike. I mean, if what we were saying was of no significance, there would be no need to censor us.
And I think we should say that for several years, those of us who carried out these kind of critiques we were certainly pushed to the fringes, but there was nothing put in place to, in essence, impede. Yes, we couldn't reach a mainstream audience, but we could express ourselves on the internet. We could, and that's now what they are seeking to eradicate. And let me just add a little bit to what you said about Marx, because Marx, of course, built his hopes with Engels around the industrial working class. And the industrial working class were sitting here in the midst of the heartland of deindustrialized America, that through global trade agreements by the kind of global corporate oligarchs, they have moved industrial production into places like China, where you make $1 an hour and work 12 hours a day, or Bangladesh, where you make 32 cents an hour, in essence, rolling us all the way back to the mid-19th century with the birth of the Industrial Revolution, when workers were wage slaves, when workers were treated in absolutely horrendous conditions. That has all been replicated in places like China. And of course, China uses extensively prison labor, and we have 1 million people incarcerated in this country who work for for-profit corporations. And so that's, and I think the World Socialist Web Site is aware of this, that's why this is not, we can't get caught up in kind of national boundaries. Because if we can't bring a kind of consciousness and build alliances and solidarity with, for instance, sweatshop workers in Bangladesh, we're never going to bring this system down. This has to be a global fight where the oppressed working peoples whose interests are our interests create an international connections because we're all fighting the same enemy, and it is supranational. It is now, and of course we see it with the tax havens. What I think $4 trillion in offshore accounts. There is, in essence, even before the 2017 tax bill, there's been a tax boycott that has been created by, companies like General Electric don't even pay taxes, Bank of America, everything else. This is a global battle, and that's certainly something that Marx and the old kind of communist movement got, which we have to recapture.
And the astonishing element of this is absolutely true, is that the objective conditions which now exist in the world actually are leading directly to that taking place. The emergence of transnational corporations, international capital flows, has, objectively speaking, internationalized the working class. There's no longer, in scientific terms, anything like a purely national product or a national economy. And the integration of capitalism has produced an globally integrated working class. And I think what is unique about the period we're now in is that the class struggle is going to unfold objectively as an internationally coordinated process. We are seeing that. And I think this really goes to what underlies in the most fundamental sense the fear of the internet. And that is, it is not only a means of getting out news, it is a powerful instrument of international coordination. We see that from our own experiences. We began, I'll give you an example. We were reporting on a strike of auto workers in Romania. And then we became aware of the fact that our articles on the Romanian strike were being translated into Romanian. We were being contacted by workers in Romania. They are following carefully international developments. This is an international broadcast. And so in a certain sense, what is happening here is an expression, I hope at a very conscious level, of an objective process. And so it isn't, what we're trying to give expression to is something which is objectively taking place. We're living in a period of world socialist revolution, and that's why all governments today, and when Marx wrote, as we keep on talking, all the governments of the world are frightened, Guizot, and he talks of, all governments in the world today are terrified of a force which they have lost control.
And that's why you see internet censorship in places like China. The attempt to impose internet censorship in India. I think we should also, in Julian Assange, his book he did with Jacob Appelbaum, Cypherpunks, kind of was one of the first books I read that kind of laid out the kind of Janus-like quality of the internet, because everything you say is true. On the other hand, it is an incredible mechanism for surveillance, for building profiles, for monitoring dissidents. And because people use electronic forms of communication to organize, actually I would say electronic forms of communication are not good organizing tools. They're good for creating the logistics to organize. Organization has to be done face to face, as we saw in the Occupy movement, as we see with any movement. It can't be done in front of a screen, but you can set it up logistically. And after the eradication of the Occupy encampments, we saw the security and surveillance state. I was especially aware of it with the figures who were driving the occupation in Zuccotti Park, is that in the aftermath, the weeks and months afterwards, the security and surveillance apparatus, the FBI, Homeland Security, and others, targeted the most important individuals, and they got the right people. And they would do it, I'll use one case where they literally manufactured a charge that one of the activists had tried to assault a New York City police officer with a pair of scissors. Now, they filmed everything in Zuccotti 24. They had cranes where they were filming. But of course, they didn't have that moment on the film because it was a manufactured charge. They hauled this person in front of a court. And assaulting a police officer is a 7-year sentence. It's a felony conviction. They force them to plea out, but take a felony conviction with a 5-year probation, which means that if they do anything within that 5 year, they can go serve that 7 year. So they unfortunately used the internet, the mechanisms of social media that were important, and this is something that Julian has written and spoken quite a bit about. So, I mean, that also has to be an element that the internet is not a benign force. It is in the hands of the people that we are trying to, let's not mince words, overthrow. And that gives them tremendous amounts of power. It is the complete concentration of systems of information under corporate control. And that's very dangerous.
Well, this is, of course, a danger. I mean, there's every technology. It depends in the end who controls it and who uses it. But I think when we look at the situation, the very fact that a discussion such as this one can take place, it can be followed by an international audience, and ideas such as these can be presented, represents and contains within it a tremendous potential. And it is that which they are trying to stop.
Right.
They have, in a certain sense, the internet has unleashed a force which is shaking every government. And just to come back to the question of repression, anyone who is serious about the struggle against capitalism must take that seriously. But in the end, if I can just take up the issue of the experience of not just Zuccotti Park, but the events of 2011, which are very important, where you had a genuine mass movement of the working class in Egypt, not a movement of the middle class who were asking to occupy Wall Street. I mean, it was a mass movement of the working class. The problem there was the absence of political perspective, the absence of an understanding of what it was they were fighting, the confusion over the nature of the Muslim Brotherhood, confusion over the nature of the army, the state. So I think ultimately, the issue of of perspective is the critical question. Does one have a correct analysis and correct policies which can be oriented to the working class? And I think this is the central issue. I mean, what we're seeing, what is different now, is 50 years after the May June event, and I suppose you're a bit of a youngster, you might not remember it, I still do. That was the birth or the period of the New Left. And in the aftermath, a rejection of the role of the working class, and for many reasons, a period of tremendous political confusion. Now one is seeing the reemergence, a renewal of interest in socialism, a renewal of interest in Marxism, and that's now part of the conversation. I'm struck, though, just yesterday, Bernie Sanders wrote a column decrying all the ills of inequality, and he managed in such an article never to mention the word socialism, never to mention the word capitalism.
Well, and he also never mentions the word imperialism.
Of course not, and he's pro-war.
You can't be a socialist unless you're an anti-imperialist.
Precisely.
This is my problem with Sanders.
I think you have many problems with Sanders,
yeah,
but that's a significant one.
I think all that you say is true. However, we can't be naive to the fact that we are also, as any society that becomes polarized and in essence dysfunctional. Because what happens when an elite or a cabal seizes power, whether that's monarchic or Stalinist or fascist? In essence, they create political paralysis because the systems of government that are ostensibly set up to under a liberal capitalist democracy to ameliorate the problems of the working class. This is what we saw with the New Deal, to create enough reforms to bring insurgent forces back into the system. I mean, Roosevelt writes about this quite openly and says that his greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. And in one of his letters, in his private letters, he talks about revolution. He's writing to a fellow oligarch and said, either we begin to give up some of our money now or we may lose all of our money. That system is broken down. And this is Death of the Liberal Class, is a book about this. That system no longer works.
But there are objective reasons for that. American imperialism no longer occupies the position which it had at the end of the Second World War.
And also the fact that the corporate structures cannibalized and destroyed the very institutions that acted as a kind of safety valve to bring enough balance within the system to thwart revolt. All of that system has been destroyed in the name of anti-communism, because after they destroyed the radical movements, the Wobblies, the Communist Party, the Socialists, the Progressive Party, they turned on the very liberal institutions, because everything that Roosevelt did came out of those radical movements. This is the whole point of Howard Zinn's The History of the United States. I mean, for instance, King, through Ruskin, when they carry out these sit-down strikes, what we don't read because it's been erased from history is that the Communist Party was doing this in the 1920s. It was a tactic that was lifted from the Communist Party. And so the destruction of those radical movements, which were the true engines that opened up American quote-unquote democracy. This was always a closed system, and we still live in one. It's how the person who wins the popular vote by 3 million votes is not president. It has nothing to do with Russia. It has to do with the Electoral College. And so with the death of those liberal institutions, then what we get is all systems we're watching a naked kleptocracy at the moment serve the interests of this tiny cabal, and that creates, and we're potentially on the cusp of a government shutdown. That creates, in essence, paralysis. And the longer that paralysis continues, in essence, the inability of government and official institutions to respond to the increasing grievances and difficulties of the working class, that the system eventually seizes up. And that's where we are.
Well, again, if we come, as you're raising so many issues, that is very important, because we have to always come back, I think, to what are the fundamental objective causes of this phenomena. And I think the general crisis, I mean, why is it not possible for the American ruling class to produce a Roosevelt? Why do they come up with a Trump? I mean, Trump is not some monster who is interloped on what was, until he showed up, a Garden of Eden. You know as well as I do that the choice presented between Trump and Clinton was, as far as the masses of people were concerned, no choice at all.
Right.
And Trump only won because he tapped into, and we see this phenomenon not just in the United States, but in other countries, he tapped into a deep anger over social conditions which exist for great masses of people. But the underlying cause of this is the breakdown of any viability of a national program.
Right.
And there's no national solution to the problems of American capitalism. The effort of the United States to overcome this through a policy of war, because what ultimately is imperialism?
Right.
The inability to solve the problems of the nation state within national borders drives the policy of war and conquest. That is what is emerging under conditions of war, threat of war, conditions of growing and immeasurable inequality. Democracy cannot survive. The tendency now is the suppression of democracy.
Right. Well,
And just as there's no national solution for capitalism, there's no national solution for the working class.
That's right. And I also want to throw in that these conditions also are fertile ground for proto-fascism or fascism, which we see in the Christian right, and I wrote a book called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. I graduated from Harvard Divinity School. I don't use the word fascist lightly. They are fascists. Under that fusion of the iconography and language of the state of American nationalism with the iconography and language of the Christian religion is exactly what the Nazi German Christian church did. And Trump, who has no political, it's a vacuum. It's a political vacuum. We are watching this Christian fascism fill that vacuum. And that's why Noam Chomsky correctly says, you can think that getting rid of Trump is great, but Michael Pence will be worse.
Well, I just wanted to take this opportunity to interject, and the topic of war was brought up by both of you, obviously, the need for internationalism. I wanted to read a statement of support that was sent in by Cindy Sheehan, the anti-war activist who became famous for her outspoken opposition to the Iraq War. I send my most comradely greetings to this very important and necessary event and to the esteemed speakers. I would also like to send my gratitude to the WSWS and SEP for taking leadership in this urgent struggle against internet censorship. I have read and completely agree with the statement from journalist John Pilger and would not have much to add on the subject of internet censorship, except that I would add the national security state is devising more and more ways not only to suppress dissent, but to guide internet users to think that what the empire wants us to think. The owner of the largest social media site has brazenly admitted as much, with surprisingly mild, if any, outrage against it, present company excluded. And hey, if propaganda isn't working fast enough to have us marching in lockstep with the war machine, a very convenient yet fake ballistic missile warning to the people of Hawaii might do the job. I hope to be tuning in online, but I also hope we will hear what we need to do to oppose this latest vicious attack on our freedom of speech and freedom to gather in opposition to the U.S. empire. She obviously raises very many critical issues and topics that we've been discussing. She also raises many of the questions that our own readers have and viewers have asked over the course of this discussion. What next? Carolyn writes, so what is the solution? Others respond, what specific, we have a comment from Joseph, what specifically can the citizenry do as individuals to end internet censorship? Another from Ben Franklin writes, do you think socialists and revolutionaries have to set up alternate channels of communication over the internet, or is it more likely that we'll have to resort to classical print-based publications? We have Dirk3 writes, please describe the organization process. How can internet users have the slightest hope of preventing the corporate takeover of internet infrastructure? So this is addressed, obviously, to both of you.
Well, a lot of questions there. I think, again, this discussion is taking place within the context of enormous crisis internationally. Anyone who believes that the World Socialist Web Site has been exaggerating about the danger of war just has to see what happened over the weekend in Hawaii. And I don't think one would have had such a response of panic had it not been for the fact that people are internalizing these events. They're taking it seriously and beginning to realize that the threat, to borrow a term used by Julian Assange, is existential, that the danger of a nuclear war is enormous, and such dangers tend to concentrate attention and consciousness. People begin to recognize that they must involve themselves in politics and examine questions more profoundly and more seriously. Now, from the standpoint of what is the danger of war all about, ultimately, the United States is seeking to reestablish its global hegemony, and there is no specific way that can be done. I don't have the time, and we can quote here, but there's many articles on the website. The statements by high-level people in the military itself, how great the danger of war is. What can stop it? Only a movement towards socialism. And there is an integration of these questions. Vast levels of inequality, imminent danger of war. Such conditions are not compatible with democracy. Democracy needs to be suppressed. That's what is happening.
Let me throw in, we are at war, and we have been at war now for 16 years. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I spent 7 years in the Middle East, many months in Iraq. And this was the greatest strategic blunder in the late American empire, equivalent to the Athenian Empire's invasion of Sicily, in which their entire fleet was sunk and most of their soldiers were killed, which then saw an outbreak of revolts throughout the empire. It is the essence, of our Suez, where in 1956 the British and the French attempt to counter Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal and have to withdraw in humiliation. And the empire never recovers after that. It essentially, until of course the pound sterling is removed as the world's currency, which sends the British economy into freefall. And once the US dollar is no longer the world's currency, we will suffer instant economic collapse. We certainly are going to suffer another economic meltdown because Wall Street is playing all the games to see the stock market once again is rising in this fictitious bubble. But that forces empire to retract. This strategic miscalculation, which is characteristics of all late empires, is draining the lifeblood of the United States already. I mean, I think David is right that they are so foolish that they may attempt to open another war front. But we've already spent, I think, $7 trillion, not to mention the human cost of the war, not only for Americans, but in particular for Iraqis, Afghanis, Pakistanis, Yemenis, and this is, of course, the Saudi campaign in Yemen, which nobody wants to talk about, horrific cholera outbreaks. And so, yes, that's right. That is the classic response of late empire, is to, and we may very well see something with North Korea because, as Randolph Bourne said, war is the health of the state. And in the name of war, we already are seeing dissidents such as us attacked as foreign agents of Russia. I mean, one of the things David didn't mention, although you're well aware of it and you've written on it, is that ostensibly the reason these algorithms are in place is to stop fake news. Now, neither your website nor Truthdig nor Counterpunch publishes fake news for Russia. But they are using that argument, and in a time of war, it's much easier to demonize dissidents. I mean, Karl Liebknecht, the great revolutionary, was killed after the Spartacus uprising with Rosa Luxemburg. Used to say the enemy is at home, i.e., the enemy is German militarism, and our enemy is at home. Why are, for instance, we continuing these wars, especially in Afghanistan, which we've lost? I mean, the Taliban is totally resurgent, controls unlike Iraq, only about 20% of Afghans live in urban areas. There were 80% live in the countryside, which are either in dispute or controlled by the Taliban, and even parts of Kabul and Kandahar are often have Taliban presence. So, why do you continue those wars? Why are you ramping up potentially a war with Russia? Because of an arms industry. Because war is a good business for Raytheon and Halliburton and Northrop Grumman. When I was in Warsaw, I landed at the airport, a giant billboard from Raytheon. President Reagan had promised Gorbachev with the fall of the Berlin Wall that NATO would not be expanded beyond Germany, and yet it was expanded all the way up to Russia's border, which makes no sense. I mean, it's antagonistic and unnecessary, except for the arms industry, because Czechoslovakia, Poland, all of these countries then have to reconfigure their entire weapon systems, which were Soviet, to be compatible with NATO weapon systems. It's billions and billions of dollars. And that's what you've seen with the Trump administration. It has been unable to fight the deep state and the arms industry on this.
Well, I think they're so closely integrated. And I think in the final analysis, I think it's so important to really always come back to this. War is catastrophic, but they see no way out. War is not an expression of the strength of the system. It's an expression of profound and deep crisis. Trotsky said in the transitional program, the ruling elites toboggan with eyes closed toward catastrophe. I mean, they went in 1939, they went to war as in 1914, aware of the potentially disastrous, certainly in 1939, they knew what the consequences of war. War brings revolution. But they could not see a way out. And the global problems which exist can only be solved in one of two ways. The capitalist imperialist solution is war, and as you said, fascism. The working class solution is socialist revolution. And this, I think, is the alternative we're confronted with. Yeah. And so the questions which come up, in the broadest sense, what is the answer to the problems we face? Building a revolutionary party.
Well, and just to get to some of the specifics about organizing, of course, the elites seek, and have been quite successful at it, into channeling energy back into a dead system, i.e. the Democratic Party. And this was why, not that he cared or that it mattered, I would not endorse Bernie Sanders. Because all of that money, all of that energy, and remember he even used the word revolution, ended up him running around the country telling everyone to vote for Hillary Clinton.
Which was perfectly predictable.
Which was completely predictable. The Democratic Party establishment...
And he had many enablers.
Yes, was never going to allow Sanders to take the nomination. We see it with the leak of the DNC emails, and then the chairwoman's own confession in her book that Hillary Clinton was running the DNC. But then, the mechanisms they had, for instance, to preclude independent voters from voting in the primaries. And I would just throw out that primaries, by the way, are not paid for by the parties. They're paid for by the taxpayers. The stealing of the Nevada caucus, $1 billion of dark money, of corporate money pumped into the coffers of the Clinton campaign. This was never going to happen. So I think we have to not be seduced or fooled into thinking that the system is capable of reforming itself, or that we are capable of reforming the system. Our model has to be a South African model of non-cooperation. Everything we do has to impede the structures of power. I think I was out at Standing Rock in North Dakota. The water protectors provided a good example for that, in essentially physically blocking the Dakota Access Pipeline, which of course Trump comes into office and signs into law. And look at the difference between the Women's March in Washington, which was really, I think, political theater, much of it orchestrated by the Democratic Party. Debbie Wasserman Schultz was there speaking at one of the venues, which gives you an insight into the response in Washington and the response at Standing Rock. Over 700 arrests, brutal evictions, rubber bullets, pepper spray, attack dogs, water cannons laced with pepper spray in sub-zero temperatures, constant infiltration. When I was there 24 hours a day, that encampment was being buzzed with aircraft photographing. They blocked the roads when this was in November, and so we had to go all the way around and come in from the other side. But even on the back roads, we were running into roadblocks set up by private security mercenaries who were wearing military-style uniforms and carrying long-barreled weapons, but had no form of identification at all.
Well, on the topic of civil war, certainly the ruling elite sees the question of control over the internet as an existential threat. We reported on the World Socialist website about hearings in the Senate and in the House in which you had testimony from the various heads of Google, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as intelligence officials. One of them, Clint Watts, wrote that unlike conventional media, he wrote, civil wars don't start with gunshots, they start with words. America's war with itself has already begun. We must all act now on the social media battlefield to quell the information rebellions that can quickly lead to violent confrontations and easily transform us into the divided states.
Let me just interject and say everyone should read Max Blumenthal's article in Alternet about him, because he's a total nutcase. He's a right-wing conspiracy theorist, who has no credibility at all. But of course, he's useful at this particular moment.
I think when we speak about the internet, why it's important, why the World Socialist Web Site is a critical instrument of the struggle for socialism, because the most critical issue is the development in the working class of program. There is going to be, and there is already unfolding, massive social struggles. The question of social revolution is not utopian. It is a process which emerges objectively out of the contradictions of capitalism. And I think the argument can be, and I think we've made this argument, that really since 2008, we have been witnessing an acceleration of crisis. It's never been solved. And indeed, the massive levels of social inequality are themselves not the expression of a healthy, but a deeply diseased socioeconomic order. It is fueling at every level social opposition. Of course, the great problem that is overcoming the legacy of political confusion produced, as a matter of fact, by the defeats and the betrayals of the 20th century, the betrayal of the Russian Revolution by Stalinism, the betrayals of the working class by social democracy, the subordination of the working class in the United States to the Democratic Party. These are the critical issues and lessons which have to be learned, and the education of the working class in these issues and the development of perspective is the most critical point. I think it's important to understand the dangers, but one has to understand the possibilities and also understand the significance of the historical lessons. I mean, our approach is that these lessons are critical in the development of a new revolutionary movement. The basic problem is not an absence of courage, it's not an absence of a desire to fight, it is an absence of understanding.
And organization, when you say.
But the organization there are many different forms of organization. I mean, the organization proposed by middle-class groups or confrontations of one sort or another, absence a perspective, absence an understanding of the historical trajectory of revolutionary struggle, drawing from the greatest experience of the 20th century, which was the October Revolution. And both from that victory and from the tragedy which followed its betrayal. No one can speak intelligently today about politics if you are not familiar with Trotsky's struggle against Stalinism. If you do not answer we experienced that. Why did the New York Times during the past year devote so many articles to denouncing and distorting and falsifying the Russian Revolution? Because that's the experience and the event they're frightened of. That was an example of the intersection of a conscious Marxist leadership with a objectively mass revolutionary movement of the international working class. And I think if we look at the present historical period, this world movement is resuming. That's what they're frightened about. They would say, the ruling elites, that to them, the internet poses an existential threat. How can they stop it? And I'd like to just make a number of suggestions. First of all, I think the question of what we can do comes in several levels. Most broadly, and I hope I've gotten this point across, we need to build an international revolutionary movement of the working class, and we appeal to all those who are listening to become active in the Socialist Equality Party or the International Committee, promote the readership of the World Socialist Web Site. But we also today are discussing within this framework the need for a rigorous and determined defense of free speech, democratic rights. I think this debate which we're having, approaching these issues from different standpoints, is immensely valuable. Cannon, the founder of the American Trotskyist movement, once said, "The truth never hurt anyone provided he was on the level."
Right.
and we're both on the level, so we're not going to get hurt by this type of discussion. But what we are going to propose is, first of all, and I hope that this will be taken up, we're initiating the formation of a coalition of socialist and anti-war websites. We welcome participation, regardless of differences which we may have on questions of interpretation, program, and history, but those who are committed to the fight for socialism and opposition to the war, and that means inevitably opposition to the Democratic Party, the two-party system, the bourgeois political setup, that a coalition needs to be formed to rigorously defend internet freedom, net neutrality, to organize the defense of both websites and individuals who come under attack. This is a critical, and I hope that this appeal receives a very strong response. The World Socialist Web Site and the International Committee is willing, on this principle basis, to work with those who understand the critical issues involved. But above all, we want to defend internet freedom because we believe that the need for the development of an understanding of the crisis of capitalism, the fight for revolutionary program, is the most critical issue. Issues can be fought out, debated as they must be, and that's how we see the path forward. Chris, you?
Yeah, I think I would agree with all of that. A lot of it has to do with building that consciousness, and there are powerful mechanisms, and I don't want to keep going back to my books, but Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy, and Triumph of Spectacle is a kind of, like Guy Debord, this, the way that, look at Cicero when he attacked the arena, when the Roman citizenry at the height of the decadence of the Roman imperial empire invested its emotional, intellectual life in the games. There are powerful distracting mechanisms of spectacle. All totalitarian societies, that's what they're good at. They're good at spectacle. Ours is no different. And it requires people to be proactive, to break themselves. I mean, I don't have a television in my house, and yet I am, because of airports and public spaces, current with the crap, the garbage that's spewed out, both in terms of popular entertainment and these are all mechanisms, in essence, to anesthetize ourselves intellectually. There is, if you want to understand how systems of corporate capitalism work, then I think you have to be rooted in a print-based culture. You have to read Marx, you have to read Trotsky, you have to read Polanyi, you have to read Sheldon Wolin's Democracy Incorporated. And I look at these diversions as essentially mechanisms which are now delivered 24 hours a day on handheld electronic devices as ways to stop people from examining the objective conditions that have brought us to this point. I can't stress the importance of education in that sense enough, whether that's autodidactic, you don't have to go to a fancy school to get it. As a matter of fact, most people going to fancy schools, I just taught at Princeton last spring, are going to Goldman Sachs. But you have to be conscious. And I think an important part of that consciousness is going back to the classic revolutionary texts. We mentioned Gramsci, Rosa Luxemburg, being conversant with revolutionary theory, understanding how power works, Kennedy, crowds and power. I mean, there's all sorts of great works we still have access to. They haven't taken that away from us, but that's an important element in building resistance.
Let me just say, since Chris has mentioned his books, and I do recommend them, they're very good and interesting books, and Chris is just completing another book. The title is?
It's called America, the Farewell Tour.
Okay. It will be a bumpy one. I'd like to urge people to read The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century, and not because I've written it, but because it is an attempt to sum up the critical experiences of the 20th century. You may recall that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the word went out that history was over, the end of history. Well, it wasn't the end of history. It wasn't even the end of the 20th century. We are working through and must work through the lessons of the revolutionary experiences. I certainly recommend the reading of Liebknecht and Luxemburg. Liebknecht said, and all that, she took from Robert Burns. But the point is, whatever the obstacles are, objective conditions are producing a revival of revolutionary struggle. And with all the dangers, and they're immense, and the problems, and they're huge, we're responsible for what we do. Our challenge is to provide an increasingly insurgent world movement of the working class with the ideas and the program which it needs to understand the political situation it confronts. You mentioned a number of works. What was the answer to what is to be done? Socialist consciousness must be brought into the working class. And I'd like to appeal to our readers, and especially young people. There is a working class. That working class is open now and receptive to revolutionary ideas. Our challenge is to create conditions. The workers will not learn this in the universities. The Marxist movement, the Trotskyist movement must provide the working class with the intellectual, cultural tools it requires so that it understands what must be done. It will provide the force, it will provide the determination, the emotional and passionate fuel of every revolutionary movement is present, but what it requires is understanding. And we're seeking to defend internet freedom because we want to make use of this medium, along with others, to create conditions for this education, revolutionary revival of revolutionary consciousness to take place. And that's, I think, the central purpose. And again, I want to appeal to our many listeners to become active, contact us. I think that all the contact information is there. And also to others who are active in websites, to take seriously what we're saying. We're perfectly prepared and, in fact, very eager to create the best conditions for an indefatigable defense of democratic rights. We yield to nobody in our determination to do this, and I think we will find an enormous amount of support among youth, students, and workers for this.
Well, it looks like our hour is up for the program. I'd like to thank...
And I want to thank Chris for being brave enough to come and to participate. I really do appreciate, and I also want to thank Julian Assange for having sent this message, and John Pilger for having come forward and made these statements, and we hope that this is the beginning on such a basis for further discussions and collaboration, development of a powerful movement in defense of democratic rights.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, I'd like to thank both of our guests for participating today, and I would appeal to all of our readers and listeners and viewers to contact us on the form below the view screen or at endcensorship.org. Also, to donate to the World Socialist Web Site. If you would like to see more live events and discussions like this is only the beginning, but it requires financial resources. So I would ask you to get involved, donate, and contact us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.